Okay, let's get started. Welcome to today's HAO colloquium. Today we're very happy to have Dr. Stan Sazykin. Stan received his bachelor degree in physics from Moscow Institute of Physics and Technology in '94, and then a PhD in physics from Utah State University in 2000. And after that, he went to Rice University and held appointment there as a research scientist. And then he joined the Department of Physics and Astronomy there, where he's now a senior faculty fellow. And at Rice, he's a member of the Space and Planetary Plasma Group. And his main research is on developing and applying numerical models of magnetospheres and ionospheres of the Earth, as well as Jupiter and Saturn. Stan?
Thank you. Faculty Fellows is Rice's designation for research faculty. It's a fancy way to designate research faculty. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, so the topic of the talk is interactions of ionospheric magnetospheric plasmas, numerical simulations with one model. Okay, to get started, I want to show I have been working on. Well, it illustrates the system that I have been working on, but it also shows one of the problems. So, the figure shows the Earth and various physical, chemical, and dynamic processes that take place. So there is ionosphere and thermosphere and all kinds of things. And it's complicated. It's hopelessly complicated and everything. But then the rest of the system, the magnetosphere, it's just some connections, right? So something comes in, something maybe goes out. But that's the big system, and then it's connected. And historically, that's how modeling the ionosphere developed. So, you start building first principles models of the ionosphere and thermosphere, and of course you improve the physics, you improve the chemistry, do all the difficult stuff and sophisticated stuff, but interaction with the magnetosphere is just an external driving force that you can somehow impose. And that has reached its limit. Okay, there are some things that you can no longer do with that. Interestingly, simulating the terrestrial magnetosphere developed in a similar way. So either magnetospheric, global magnetohydrodynamic models or small region kinetic models have been developed, and they're very sophisticated, and they have been getting more and more sophisticated. But as far as the ionosphere, it's that little 1RE shell down there that's an inner boundary condition. So you just impose some boundary condition, and most of the time it doesn't matter anyway. And in the last 15 years, significant effort has gone into going beyond that, developing what I call coupled models. And some progress has been achieved, but it's still not where it should be. So what I want to talk about is one model. Well, it's actually two models, but I'm going to call it one model. I will explain why. It's a model that describes, it's the first principles ionosphere model, same as 3, okay, that was developed at NRL. And it works together with an inner magnetospheric model, Rice convection model, which we have developed at Rice. Well, people at Rice have developed over a long time. So the simulation domain is a 3D region, that extends from the bottom of the ionosphere up to some nominal altitude. Now, a couple of things that make it unique and suitable for my purposes. Well, first of all, let me talk about these equations. So these are the standard equations that you would solve. Continuity equation for the ions, what's called ion velocity equations, ion temperature equations, and then you have your electron momentum equation and electron temperature equation. Now, to solve these, you need a couple of things. Well, one thing that you need is this electric field that enters as a transport term. And the electric field comes from two sources. One is the neutral wind dynamo, and the other one is the magnetosphere. So you have to have some sort of magnetospheric input into these equations. You can't close them. The other thing is, so on the left-hand side of the ion velocity equation, there is this inertial term. Now, most of the time, it's neglected in ionospheric models. And if you neglect it, then you can rewrite these equations in such a way that you can take long time steps. Okay, so if you simulate the ionosphere without that term, you can take time steps up to a minute or longer. If you don't neglect that, and SAME-3 is the only model that doesn't, you no longer have that luxury. So you actually have to, your time step has to go down to something like a second or so. So that's a penalty. That's the price to pay. Now, what you get out of it is two things. One, you can actually extend your modeling region to high altitudes as to, say, 800 kilometers. You can go into the plasma sphere, where densities get really low, so you get sound waves there. So with that term, you can do sound waves and not break your equations. Now, the way it's done in SAME is you decompose these equations into parallel and perpendicular components. So you have motion along magnetic field lines and motion perpendicular. Perpendicular, of course, you can neglect that, but motion along field lines retains that term. So the main consequence is that you have this 1 or 2 second time step that you have to maintain. The grid in SAME-3 is like this. This is a longitudinal slice. So the grid is organized, so it's a distorted grid that's organized using magnetic field lines. It's non-orthogonal, so it's curvilinear, but it does allow you to go to high altitudes into the plasma sphere. So you no longer have to cut off your modeling region at some nominal altitude. That's an advantage. So if you imagine this slice and you rotate it around the Earth, put it at different longitudes, then you get a three-dimensional grid. That's the SAME-3 grid. It's about, in the version that we use, is about 2.5 million grid cells. Back to the electric fields. So the electric fields come from neutral wind dynamo and from the coupling to the magnetosphere through field-aligned currents. And usually the way you solve it in SAME is that you have a current conservation equation like that. But you have to have the sources in the form of, if you assume the electric field is potential, which is what you would usually do, then you have this right-hand side in the current conservation equation that has field-aligned currents and has neutral winds. Now, the neutral winds you can do in SAME-3 if you know what they are, if you impose neutral winds. And so SAME-3 just assumes them. But the parallel currents have to come from the magnetosphere. So you have to rise above that shell and go out and do something else. It is important to do that because these electric fields are transient. They can be transient and highly variable. So it is not sufficient to impose. Well, you can impose electric fields at high latitudes like a convection pattern using some empirical models or something like that. But you cannot do that at low latitudes. So at low latitudes, electric fields become a little bit more complicated. So this is where the Rice convection model comes in. So the Rice convection model is in a magnetospheric model. And if you imagine this, okay, so this is noon midnight cross-section of the magnetosphere. If you take this black region, and you kind of rotate it around, that's the modeling region because of this kind of donut-shaped region that has ionosphere at the bottom and then this donut on the outside. And what we can do in it is, let me advance one step here and show the equations. So we solve the equation that is essentially a form of a guiding center Vlasov equation. So it's collisionless plasmas there in the magnetosphere. And you solve for the phase space density. And this is the transport equation that we use, written symbolically like this. And it has drift terms. These are drift terms. And the drift velocities depend on it has gradient curvature drift, but they also have the E cross B drift it comes out of this potential in the magnetospheric frame, this phi. Okay, and the phi has to be determined again from the current conservation equation. which is identical to the one that SEMI uses. The right-hand side of it, the left-hand side is the same, so essentially divergence of the ionospheric current. The right-hand side is a specific form of the field line currents. Okay, so it relates field line currents to the particle pressure and gradients of it. So the same equation, and here we solve for it. So the two models sort of overlap in this equation. This equation can be shared by the two models. What we cannot do is this conductance stanza. Well, we can do part of it. We can do auroral particle precipitation, but we cannot do the rest of it. You have to assume something about the ionosphere. But SEMI-3 can do that. So that kind of summarizes what the Rice convection model does. It calculates sort of all relevant magnetospheric quantities if you impose boundary conditions and solar wind conditions and plasma sheet conditions, but it does need the conductance stanza. Oh, and one more thing that I wanted to say about the Rice convection model. Because these equations are non-linearly coupled, it puts a limit, it's not obvious, but it can be shown, that it puts a limit on the time step. Because of potential to develop instabilities, your time step is limited to 1 or 2 seconds. So it just happens to be about the same time step as SEMI-3 uses. And computationally what we use in that model is about 10,000, on the order of 10,000 grid cells in the ionospheric spatial grid, and about 200 energy levels, because you have to solve in the energy space too. And so it just turns out to be about 2.5 million grid cells total again. So they're destined for each other. It turns out that you can simply couple the two models through this current conservation equation. You can solve one of them, one version, and in it the conductance stanza, the sort of non-precipitation part can come from SEMI by evolving the full 3D ionospheric distributions and species and everything. The field line currents come from the magnetosphere, and then you solve for the potential, and that potential is used by both models. It's used by the Rice convection model to advance the particles in the inner magnetosphere, and it is used by the SEMI, by SEMI-3 to do perpendicular transport in the ion velocity equations. The time steps are about the same. So what you do is you basically just walk the two sets of equations along with the same time step. And you don't have to subcycle or do anything else. Moreover, there are no quantities that, okay, so in some coupled models, you have to carry quantities in each model. For example, when you couple inner magnetospheric models to global MHD, each of them has to have its own particle pressure, and it's not the same. So they have to maintain the two particle pressures. Or field line currents, you can have field line currents in one model and another model, and you can, sometimes you cannot reconcile them. But in this case, you don't have that problem. So that's why I call it one model. You can just walk the two sets of equations alone in time and share through this equation. Why is it important? Well, so the inner magnetospheric model solves for this potential, and it's modulated by the particle population in the inner magnetosphere. It makes electric fields transient sometimes. So this is an example of what I mean. These are ion drifts measured by the DMSP. Some of you may have seen this figure, but these are ion drift perpendicular to the DMSP track. So DMSP spacecraft orbits at dusk, essentially goes through dusk. And it measures the E cross B velocity that's perpendicular to the track. I think in this case it's the zonal velocity. And so each vertical streak is the velocity coded by also its directions. So the red is anti-sunward, and then blue is sunward. So the spacecraft goes from the polar cap. It measures anti-sunward convection. Then it goes into the auroral zone. This is sunward return flow. Then it goes through mid and low latitudes, and then goes back. And so if you stack these measurements this way, you can see, so the polar cap convection, the auroral zone convection, not much in between. So in between, whatever you have would be neutral wind dynamo. But if you look at, for example, a big storm, okay, this is a big storm, this is one of the biggest magnetic storms, then you can see, so when the DST drops like that, you can see that this blue stuff leaks all the way to the equator. Okay, so that's one example to demonstrate what penetration. And these electric fields would be transient, but they would affect the ionosphere. So it's important to calculate. There is no empirical way to prescribe them. You have to calculate them, and that's what the RCM does. And here's another example from a different storm, essentially showing the same thing. So in this case, the storm had two main phases, and then you have two of these times when you have this penetration electric field leakage. So we can do it with this model. Now I'm going to switch and talk about measurements a little bit. So this work was in part motivated by some new measurements from the International Space Station. Okay, so electron density is measured by the International Space Station during June 22nd and 23rd, 2015 magnetic storm. That was one of the biggest storms, by the way, of this solar cycle. So there is an instrument on ISS. Here's a picture of it. This is the instrument, this thing. It's actually 5 or 6 instruments. It has 2 Langmuir probes, has some impedance probe, has some other things. It was put there for engineering purposes originally, to study spacecraft charging. But they found a way to back out electron densities. Okay, so it's a very nice instrument, and this data is now available. Has been available for a while. So it provides plasma electron densities, also temperatures, but I'm not going to look at temperatures. And so the space station basically has a low latitude orbit with a period of about 92 minutes at about 400 kilometers. So it goes through the topside F region. And I'm going to show an example. Okay, let me just put this into the context of the storm. This storm was produced by a big CME that had a sheath in front of it. So these are IMF, BX, BY, and BZ, and that's just the clock angle of the IMF. And so what happens is between roughly 16 and midnight on the first day, the big shock with minus 40 BZ, nanotesla BZ, so that's a huge value. And that created this first part of the storm that I call the sheath part. Okay, and then for the next 8 hours, it was a magnetic cloud that produced another main phase. You can see it on the DST here. There's a peak here, and then there was a second bigger peak here. Okay, so this is one of those 2 peak storms. During this time, this FPMU instrument measures ionospheric electron densities. Okay, let me quickly explain what you're looking at. So the black curve is the electron density at about 400 kilometers. And so each of these is an orbit, so this is the latitude and longitude of the orbits. The top indicator is the sun, so there's a little sunlight sensor on it that tells you where it is in terms of local times. So these periodic things are, each orbit it samples sort of equatorial ionosphere and goes a little bit up in latitude and then back, and then it goes through the dusk terminator. Okay, and then what you see is this. So this is when the storm started, and then you see these periods of kind of ratty electron densities that are much lower, more than 2 orders of magnitude. So these are dusk depletions that look like spread F. Okay, so they are probably spread F. And they happen following the onset of that sheath. And once they are observed, they sometimes can persist there for a while. Now, I should say that sometimes they're observed without storms. You can have spread F without storms. But the magnitude of these is unusually large. If I take this first one and just zoom in on it to show you how it looks like that. So this is just for a small period of time. So you have this electron density right here, and then right around the terminator before the sun goes down, you get this bite out with instabilities and irregularities and so on. If you look later in the storm during the magnetic cloud phase, you can see the same thing. So this is the next 8 hours of the storm. So you go and then you start seeing these, and then they get bigger, and then they get bigger. And, so this is severely depleted post-sunset F region at 400 kilometers. So it's a very nice data set because it shows these phenomena, but it also gives you the structure of the ionosphere. So you can use this data set to kind of validate the model, see how well can the model do, right? So what we did, we ran the simulation of the same CM for this event. We developed the model a while ago, but I never really tested it on in situ observations. So sort of the in situ, this is not just looking at the two-dimensional map of TEC or something. This actually is looking at in situ measurements at given altitude, longitude, and latitude sampling throughout the ionosphere. Early on, when we were looking at it, we noticed one thing. We noticed that these bite outs often correlated with the IMF BZ turning northward. Okay, so this is the FPMU electron density. This is the very first bite out that happened. And this is IMF BZ. So you can see it's southward, and then when it flips northward, well, that's what happens. And in fact, if you look at a bunch of these, you can almost convince yourself that they're correlated. So we were wondering what the mechanism might be. I mean, it's clearly electrodynamic, but what would it be? So I'm going to look at that too. Okay, so first I want to show the structuring of the ionosphere as predicted by SAMI. So these are color-coded electron densities at two different altitudes, 180 kilometers and 300 kilometers, so both F region. And what you're looking at is, okay, this little gap here that I plot is midnight. So you're looking at the Earth, the sun is on the other side right there. So you're looking at the Earth from a side, maybe 20 local time, from a little bit behind. So this is, this is that region of interest that I'm looking at. And what we usually do, we run the model for 24 hours before something happens, just to get some kind of equilibrium solution. So this is the equilibrium solution before the storm. And maybe I can play it. Yeah. Okay, so, the storm commences about 1845 or something. but things fluctuate, and you get that immediate sort of positive phase with increases of electron density on the night side. But after that, what you see is, especially at 300 kilometers, is this high degree of structuring that occurs. And, I always struggled with textbook explanations of what happens in the ionosphere during a storm. I could never figure out. So I find this fascinating. The contour lines are also electron density, so it's just to emphasize the degree of structure in there. So you have these depletions here at the equator, and you have two, what you might, if you could call them these horns of ionization anomaly, but they're storm time. Not as much happens at 180 kilometers, I have to say, that most of the action happens at high altitudes. And then later in the storm, you also see the trough, there's a mid-latitude trough there that develops, and it gets more and more depleted as the time progresses. Okay, so that kind of gives an overall idea of what the model predicts. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take these simulation results and put a virtual satellite through them along the ISS trajectory and just sample the solution.
Quick question.
Yeah, sure.
On the left, why does the southern hemisphere look so different?
Because it's June. It's June 22nd. It's solstice. So this is the time of the maximum tilt angle that you can have. The dipole tilt angle reaches, I believe, 35 degrees during that day. Now the model itself doesn't have a tilt angle though. So what we do is like halfway. The neutral atmosphere that we prescribe is tilted appropriately, but the magnetic field is not. So it's sort of aligned dipole. So that's why you see this terminated tilted. It's because the neutral part is tilted. It's seasonal.
But does that also explain how it's enhanced, like the green part in the south that goes towards the night side?
That's what it ends up being like. Now, I don't know to what degree that's realistic. That's sort of part of the question. But that's what the solution. That's how the solution looks like. You don't see that much again at 300 kilometers somehow. It's more pronounced at lower altitudes. But yeah, thank you for reminding me about the tilt. I meant to say that. Okay, so I'm going to take the first 8 hours, the schist part of the storm. So this is the data, electron densities. These are 3 big bite outs. Now the model itself cannot predict bite outs because to model instabilities, I mean, these irregularities, you have to go down to much finer scales, which the model doesn't have the resolution. You can do mesoscale simulations in a limited region, but a global model cannot resolve that computationally, at least not yet. But what we can do is we can look at the conditions of the ionosphere and see if they favor, if we understand a little bit about these instabilities, we can see what conditions the model predicts. Okay, but the model in general would not be expected to predict these bite outs. And I'm going to superimpose the solution, and it looks like that. That's the blue curve. The main thing about this blue curve is that it follows the black curve, kind of in terms of ups and downs. It doesn't get everything, but if you look at it, it's surprisingly good. And I never understood that, why that's the case. But nothing special. It predicts nothing special around the onset of these irregularities. But to follow up on the idea that maybe these are correlated with northward IMFBZ, I also overplotted the estimated cross-polar cap potential drop. That's the red line with the scale on the right. So the cross-polar cap potential drop is related to the IMFBZ. You can do one or the other. And indeed, I mean, there's this when the schist came, there's this big peak of convection. Well, my estimate peaks at 300 kilovolts with saturation. And indeed, when it drops down, when IMFBZ turns northward, it drops down. That's when you see the depletion. And then there is the second peak, and when it drops down, indeed, you see the depletion. There is the third time, but the third time is not as good. It's a little bit backwards. So first you see the depletion, then it drops down. So maybe that's a hint. Then I'm going to take the next 8 hours. So now we're going into the second main phase of the storm. Things are spinning up. Again, this is the data from 0 to 8 UT, and you see these depletions on 3 successive orbits. I'm going to impose the model solution, and it looks remarkably good. And I never expected it to be that, but it is. I didn't fudge it. Surprisingly, the model reproduces all these variations. It follows the structure. And now I superimpose the polar cap potential drop, and that's when things start falling apart. So you do see a peak, burst of convection here. Well, maybe nothing happens. There's another one that lasts for hours. That's the cloud. But the depletion happens right in the middle of it, before it drops. And there's the third one, well, maybe, but again, it happens after that. And the fourth one, again, it's backwards. So it becomes pretty clear that this idea falls apart. Just out of curiosity, I'm going to extend this for another 8 hours. And again, plot the same 3 things. So now we're going gradually into kind of recovery phase of the storm with still some residual convection. And what you see is, again, that's pretty good. The model follows the data. I don't understand that, but it does. Let me take it another 8 hours. Okay, so it's another 8 hours. Now we're into the recovery phase. There were no depletions during this period, but there are some there. And the depletions are no longer correlated with anything. The model reproduces variations. Now, if you pay attention, of course, you will see that now these minima are upset quite a bit from the model results. So the minimum electron densities, these minima correspond to morning-side sort of pre-sunrise ionosphere. Okay, now there is a big discrepancy. And if you go back, you can see how this discrepancy is starting to build up even here. And what it is, I think what it is that this is something like 20 hours into the storm. So this is when the neutral wind dynamo and composition changes would be expected to build up, and the model doesn't have that. So this is when discrepancy starts building up. That's an indicator that the neutral effects become very important. So the northward IMF-BZ turn-ins don't explain occurrence of depletions. However, if you go and kind of try to understand what's known about spread F, what you find is that there is an indicator of when to expect, at least on the statistical basis, when to expect spread F post-sunset. These two figures at the bottom are average variations, local time variations of the quiet time vertical upward drift to the equator. Okay, these were built from Hikamarka measurements. And they just superimposed a bunch of them. That gives you an idea about variability. But the bottom line is the vertical drift, during the day it's up. Then when you come to the dusk terminator, you have this pre-reversal enhancement. Ionosphere goes up, and then it comes down, and then it's downward during the night until morning. But at equinoxes, you get that peak. At June solstice, you don't. Okay, so this is June solstice. That's very small. It is known that the rate of occurrence of spread F is significantly higher during equinox, measurably, than during June solstice. So on an ad hoc basis, well, it's part of it ad hoc, part of it is understanding from the theory of generation of instabilities, which are essentially Rayleigh-Taylor instabilities that then non-linearly develop. What's expected is that when this happens around sunset, so the F layer goes up, and then the bottom goes away, and then it steepens, and that's favorable for generation of instabilities. So in that case, the thing to do would be to look at vertical drifts at the equator. Okay, so this is a little bit messy, but this is for the first 8 hours of the storm. Okay, so this is the storm. I took vertical drift from the solution. Okay, so this is near equatorial, like 15 degrees latitude, vertical drift at 900 kilometers altitude. Okay, so it will map to the F region at the equator if you map it along field lines. And the red curves are the drift velocities computed by the model. Okay, so basically these variations are penetration electric field due to storm time variations. And I do that at not one MLT, but not to deceive myself, but at several MLTs. But basically you can look at 18 MLT. The blue curves are IMF-BZ, but flipped upside down. So it's negative and then going positive this way. And what I was originally looking for is, when things go like this, so vertical drift goes up, then IMF-BZ goes northward, maybe, well, that's it. And it's, again, so if you look here, you can claim that they're correlated. Of course, you might say that it takes time for the ionosphere to develop instabilities. But then if you look at other times, as the time progresses, you can tell that this correlation starts shifting in the wrong way, backwards. So it's not that this causes that. However, these northward turn-ins turn out to be just coincidental things. What matters is that before IMF-BZ turns northward, it is southward. And it's the period of southward IMF-BZ that gives you this. So these are electrodynamic source of the vertical drift. It adds on the neutral wind dynamo. So this is quiet time neutral wind dynamo generated. And then we add that. So that essentially increases the pre-reversal peak. And it would be favorable for producing spread F. So if you inspect, it's a little bit messy, but if you inspect, so this is the period of southward IMF-BZ. There's a big burst of southward IMF-BZ convection. and then you see this big peak, and then it repeats again and again, and you have these 3 peaks. And these 3 peaks are the 3 depletions during the first time. And you can take, again, you can take the second period, and that becomes even more clear. So during this time, you have, again, this long period of several hours of southward MFBZ, and then you have this long period of upward drift. And then if you go back, I don't have a plot that overplots it, but then this is when this happens. It's during this period. And then it remains there on several successive orbits. So what seems to be happening is that, the fact that MFBZ turns northward when when ISS comes to the terminator is just a coincidence. What matters is this uplift of the layer. So the uplift of the layer happens for a while, and then the instrument comes and measures instabilities. And that seems to be the explanation. So it happens in both cases. So I think these are the main things that I wanted to say. Let me talk a little bit on the summary slide, just to kind of try to recap what I'm trying to say here. So we developed this model, and the model is ideally suited because you can evolve 2 sets of different equations with the same time step, on the same sort of time scales, without any contradictions in the solutions. We use the model to compare the results with in situ ionospheric electron density measurements. And it finds remarkably good agreement. I mean, it's sort of, the model is imperfect. There are some uncertainties in the inputs, but given all those, it's just remarkable how well it reproduces the data. So I think that's a good thing about the model. And the model does show systematic discrepancies in the recovery phase that build up with time. And that's an indication that probably after something like 15 or 20 hours, you cannot trust these solutions because they no longer include changes in the composition, in the neutral wind changes, and so on. So these have to be included, and the model doesn't have this, so it will have to be done separately. Regarding the depletions, so the model cannot produce them, but these seem to be explained by the periods of southward MFBZ enhanced convection that lifts the layer around the sunset terminator. And then when the spacecraft comes in at the right time, it observes these depletions. So it's essentially what I'm saying here is that penetration electric field favors generation of these instabilities around the sunset. So I think that's all I will say. Thank you.
Something you didn't go over in the coupled model, both SAMI3 and RCM need to have some kind of boundary condition at high latitude. The polar cap
Yes.
is a region they don't
Yes.
solve.
That's correct.
Especially if you're doing a storm, do you take into account an expanding and contracting polar cap boundary and how?
Let me see if I can find it.
What are you doing about this boundary problem?
Okay, so the question is about what, so SAMI needs convection potential in that region, and the RCM doesn't actually calculate it there because it's on open field lines. What we do is we put the Weimer model in there. And so the Weimer empirical model is driven by IMF and other things. Now the boundary itself expands and contracts with the magnetic field that we prescribe, which we also prescribe. So that, this oval expands and contracts as the conditions drive it, and then we prescribe the potential inside the polar cap, and then it becomes the boundary condition for the potential solver outside of it. But yes, SAMI has the electric field everywhere, and the RCM takes the boundary condition to solve for it. And inside it's empirical. But it is driven by, data-based, so to speak, model.
So SEMI is a three-dimensional fluid model solve the equations on a fixed Eulerian grid.
That's correct.
While RCM is two-dimensional in space and one-dimensional in energy space.
That's correct.
So how is this coupling between the two-dimensional model and three-dimensional model?
So the potential equation, let's see. Well, any version of it, yeah, like this one, is two-dimensional, right? The tensor is a conductance tensor, so it's field line integrated. So there is a complicated procedure that goes, it's technically complicated, but conceptually it's simple. So what the RCM has a two-dimensional grid that's placed at a nominal altitude of 100 kilometers. And so for each of these points, you trace magnetic field lines through the three-dimensional ionosphere and integrate to get the conductivity elements. And so that's what the conductance tensor here becomes. Then you solve for the potential, and SEMI takes this potential and assumes it's constant along magnetic field lines, and then you map it along field lines to all altitudes, and then you calculate the drift velocity from that. So there is this conversion 2D to 3D back and forth that's technically somewhat complicated, but
Okay, so what you're saying is that in the two models, there are no mass exchanges between them. It's just electrodynamic.
that is correct. There is no mass exchange here,
So
right?
each model has its own mass, which is my next question, is that, so during this storm, in the inner region of magnetosphere, there's another population which is the ring current ions. These are from the plasma sheet.
Right.
And that's not from SEMI.
No, it's part of this equation.
How do you do that?
Okay, so the RCM, yeah, I didn't go over that in any detail at all. So this equation is for the distribution function, for the phase space density of that population, right there, that F. And so when we solve it, well, it's a partial differential equation, right? So we take the value, it needs a boundary condition on F. And so again, it's a plasma sheet, an empirical model of the plasma sheet, and impose it on that outer boundary right there, okay? And then you have your initial conditions that you can prescribe also from quiet time measured values. And then you evolve that equation, okay? Now the equation actually, if you neglect this, it actually doesn't have any mass. It only has number density. So the ring current mass only matters from the point of view of sources and losses. But in terms of the dynamics, mass doesn't actually go into the equations.
So the idea is that SEMI run its own fluid stuff, and RCM run its ring current.
Exactly.
They talk to each other through the ionosphere electric field. So what you do is that you just add the RCM electric field to SEMI and let it drive the model. Is that what you do? Because now in the coupled models, and mass are not conserved.
Well, mass is not conserved here in any case because you have a source on the boundary. And you inject plasma to the magnetosphere. That's right. But the two populations are completely, one is a fraction of EV, the other one is 50 keV. So yeah, the only interaction in this model is electrodynamic. Right.
Is there no auroral precipitation?
There is precipitation. Yes.
Used by SEMI?
So the precipitation right now is done in RCM. So we precipitate auroral electrons, and we actually estimate the conductivity. Now what we're working on right now is that adding that to the same electron densities too. But at the moment it's not in there. So to do a kappa auroral zone is a little bit unrealistic because the electron densities don't have ionization profiles in them. But in terms of electron, it's just added directly to the conductivity.
So during the cloud period, you have extended southward IMF condition, right?
4 or 5 hours.
And you have upward drift. That means you have extended penetrating electric field during the whole period, or you don't? It's not being shielded, or whatever. So how long is the penetrating electric field?
Let's go look at that figure. It's this one.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, here you are. So it's pretty much on vertical drift.
Hours.
Several hours, yeah.
So the RCM not build up the shielding for.
Well, I mean, if you look at the magnitude, it kind of decays slowly. But yeah, during storm times, shielding is very ineffective. That's what we find. Yeah, so if you have a stepwise change sometimes and do nothing else, you will get it and then will decay about half an hour. But during storm times, when you put minus 40 nanotesla BZ, IMF BZ, then you...
Even constant BZ, right?
Yeah.
You still have the shielding.
So
you don't have the shielding.
You don't have much shielding, that's right. Yeah. And again, it depends on local time. So at the dusk, it's the most pronounced. But if you look at other places, it's not like that. So penetration electric field depends on MLT.
So that's another question. Is nighttime is the oxide.
Yeah, it can be the. That's right.
Eastward, right.
That's correct.
So you have downward.
That's right. Yep. Makes it more complicated.
Getting back to the Aurora, so you said you added it to the SAMI 3. What do you add? Do you add like broadband or something like this, or?
Okay, so we do a simplified model where we call it strong pitch angle scattering limit, and then we take a fraction of it. So essentially what it is we assume that all the electrons that get into the loss cone will precipitate. And
Basically, it's diffuse aurora.
yeah, it is physically diffuse aurora, that's right. Yeah, so your aurora would have more things that we don't have.
So how do you calculate conductance? And then based on that one, you use the Robinson?
Yeah. So we have two ways to do that. We can use Robinson, or we have an energy deposition code that actually was used to produce Robinson. Going back to Robinson called Tangle. The results are about the same. So I mean, Robinson parameterizes results from that code. So Robinson works surprisingly okay. Yeah, you can do empirical.
Actually, on this slide, it seems that they have different lead times, right? Sometimes it's almost in the previous figure in MLT, it's almost immediate response, and sometimes it seems to have a longer lead time. So that's determined by, I guess, by something else, like by the conductivity.
Well, so it comes from two sources. One is the boundary condition on the polar cap that Art was asking about. It also rotates because it comes from this empirical pattern, and that's driven by IMF, BZ, BY, and something else. So that rotates with condition. It's not just IMF BZ, and so that rotation can add to it. And the other thing is the inner magnetosphere mediates the response. So it doesn't completely shield it, but it does affect the response. Yeah. So whatever goes into that, you have injections and stuff like that. That modulates the response to it. And that's why you have to have it. If you don't have it, then you just get one-to-one correspondence.
Right.
Right.
And actually, maybe a related question. Earlier, when you first showed us, I think, observation results, it maybe I got the wrong impression.
One of these?
No, even earlier, when you first showed this.
The color plot?
Yeah. Let's see.
This one?
Maybe after this one.
Well, there's one before that.
Oh, there's one before that?
Well, there are two of these.
Okay. I was thinking the timing, it almost looks like in that case, the depletion happens almost before the IMF.
Oh, yeah, I was trying to make that point. That's right. That's why you don't correlate it with IMF BZ turning northward, because sometimes they're not correlated. The time, the causality is not there. Let me see if I can find it. Well, like this one, you can see the discrepancy in the third peak. It drops down, but after the depletion. And you can argue that so there is a little bit of, you have to propagate the IMF from the ACE spacecraft, 224 RE upstream, to the nose of the magnetopause, using the solar wind speed. And you can argue that this can be inaccurate. It's done in the best possible way, but you can make errors in this time shift. So maybe there it's a few minutes, but then when you look at the next thing, things definitely I think maybe that's the one you're talking about.
But the depletions are, timing of the depletions is largely a product of the spatial sample.
That's
right?
correct.
I mean,
That's correct. You only see them when you're there.
You're there.
That's right.
And that may have nothing to do with what the IMF.
And that's what I'm trying to say, that this is...
The IMF doesn't know what the space station is.
Exactly, right. But in this case, for example, so you have this period that Wenbin was pointing out. Okay, so there's here we go.
Another one.
No, it's okay. This always works. So there's this period here of many hours of southward MFBZ, right? And then you come and you see depletions. And so they're there. Yeah, so that kind of tells you that northward turn-ins are not the cause. But on the other hand, southward lasted for a few hours there. So, and the same thing here. Yeah, so you get the drop, but it happens after the depletion. Of course, you can argue that the depletion just sticks around there for successive orbits, right? So you can't tell what causes what. But you can always tell if you don't see depletions, then you see them. That's an observation.
One of the good questions about these depletion regions is, we typically see them from a low Earth orbiting satellite at the space station or something where you come around in a solar time, fairly constant solar time orbit and sampling different longitudes.
Right.
And you see depletion, depletion, depletion. Well, was that the same depletion that's moving? Is it three different depletions? Are these things stationary, fairly stationary?
These are excellent questions, yeah.
Are they drifting with the plasma flow?
Right.
You need a synoptic view to try to sort all
Right, and the space station itself cannot answer that question for you. That's right. You cut through it and you don't know the next cut, whether it's the same one or not. And that's part of the problem.